Either way, I just don't care anymore, so I'm not going to waste my time watching it or making videos about it. So I guess this is the end. But eventually, you have to accept that some things just aren't for you anymore. And in terms of what I want from TV and the expectations I hold to dedicate so much time to different shows, I just don't think the CW/DC universe is for me. So I think I'm done talking about it because really, I don't know what else to say. I may read up on what happens in the final season of Arrow and what happens in Crisis just to see what everything's been building to, but besides watching a fight scene on YouTube in a couple years, I'm done.
Obviously, this particular comment didn't age too well.
Welcome back, or if you're new to the channel, welcome to the official finale of my Arrow videos. I know I've said that many times before, but the thing about that is that it was a running joke. I always intended to return to Arrow, but I wanted to wait for some sort of definitive endpoint to do so, which are pretty rare among both CW shows and superhero media in general. So, when I heard that Arrow's 8th season would be its last, and it would be airing alongside the long-awaited adaptation of Crisis on Infinite Earths, I saw that endpoint. So today I'll be looking at and sharing my thoughts on the last few seasons of Arrow, which is something a lot of people seem to care about. Some care about it way too much, frankly. If you haven't seen any of my older Arrow videos yet, that's fine. They're, not very good. But if you need some catching up on where I stand on the show as a whole, good, bad, good. I had been watching Arrow since it first aired back in 2012, and even though I obviously soured on the show a bit over the years, I do have a completionist streak in me. If I get invested in a TV series and stay invested for years, I like to see it through to the end, even if it takes a while for me to get there. And with Arrow, I finally got there, and the results were, they were interesting. So, let's pick up where I left off. And the last time I saw these characters, they were all on an island that had just entirely exploded. So, I wonder how they made it out of that little jam. Going into Season 6, I had a very different perspective than the last time I talked about this show. It was kind of weird to analyze it without being an active viewer or such a ravenous fanboy. I saw the show very differently since I got some distance from it. But, as it turns out, when you're not a teenager anymore, you think better. Who knew? Still, it was nice to settle back into that specific Arrow vibe, seeing the characters again, hearing the familiar music stings and sound effects, and relaxing into the lovely, calming wave of mediocre television. Mediocrity is not this show's defining trait or anything, but if there's one thing that kept me from getting as immersed in Arrow as I used to be, it was that I couldn't help but see it as just kind of serviceable TV. I think back when Arrow started, which was around the same time I started consuming a lot of comic book media, I was so focused on the worlds and the big picture of it that I could overlook how most of the writing felt very generic. Also, I was 14, so I really had no idea what a good anything was, but also TV has evolved a lot since Arrow first premiered, and the stuff I mostly watch now doesn't have to work within the constraints of traditional network TV. Now, just to be clear, I'm not saying that I only consume, like, highbrow, complex TV or anything, because I don't. But something about the way Arrow was written, specifically the dialogue, just makes the show seem really shallow. Everything's just so straightforward and blunt. It's very expository, and almost every single thought the characters have is said out loud and directly.
It's a map of City Hall.
With ingress and egress marks in line of sight.
For an attack.
How the hell would they want to attack City Hall?
If two people are having a conversation, there's no room for subtext. You will know exactly what they're both thinking, and it won't be complicated. Especially if a secret is being kept, you'll find out by the end of the conversation exactly where everyone stands. Unless, of course, someone's yelling at someone else for keeping a secret, which is the only way CW writers seem to know how to frame conflict. Maybe it's just the way the episodes were structured in the writer's room, but because so many interactions were delivered that way, eventually eventually I just kind of zoned out. It didn't really feel necessary to pay close attention because I didn't have to. This isn't Mr. Robot. It's not that deep. I mean, did the writers think the average CW audience member was, like, dumb or something? Oh, I get it now. I mean, it could be worse. The dialogue could all be like this.
God, you were such a bitch.
Yeah, it takes one to know one, sweetheart.
Snappy one-liners were not this show's strong suit.
You are one twisted bitch.
That really hurts my feelings.
Anyway, this new perspective didn't break the show for me or anything. It was just a revelation that couldn't really go unsaid. But if you want to talk flaws, I've got a couple. If anything was holding Arrow back from being a better show, it was the 23 episode long seasons. I know this wasn't a creative choice and it was definitely imposed by the network, but it's what makes all of these CW shows drag so much. Except Riverdale, of course. I wish every season of Riverdale was 100 episodes long. But seriously, there's no reason for a show like this to run for that long per season, and the episodic aspects of Arrow have always been its weakest. That seasonal length works for procedurals, it works for comedies if the material stays strong, but when the overarching story is the most important part, the filler stands out. I also think I've just gotten better at predicting it. Like when Felicity and Curtis said they were going to form a startup company, immediately I just thought, oh, that's a time killer. It's not like that storyline never amounted to anything ever. It eventually came around with the Archer program, but in terms of padding episodes, it was noticeable. This pacing also had a negative impact on the characters' arcs, most of which were pretty simple in the first place, and when they had to be spread out over so many episodes, it often left them spinning their wheels. Still, the storylines they were given had a lot of potential and started strong, like Oliver trying to form a relationship with his son in the face of their shared trauma, even though this kid appeared to be around 14 and acted like he was 6.
The bad man was in my dream.
Other ideas I liked were Diggle taking over as the Green Arrow despite his injury and growing reliance on painkillers, and the villain team-up, but about halfway through the season, it felt like the writers were running out of stuff to do with it all. The season did switch gears pretty significantly about halfway through, but that didn't help much. This is most clearly visible in Oliver and Diggle's relationship over the course of the season. Team Arrow as a whole fell apart across season 6, but that first relationship had always been the core of the show. Yeah, big surprise. I don't think it's this one. But when their conflict reached its peak, I just didn't really buy it. They've already pulled the Diggle is mad at Oliver card so many times over the show that escalating the same argument to this degree just feels wildly out of character.
I think that you leave a trail of bodies every damn place that you go.
Also, I feel like after doing this for 5 years, these guys would have a more effective form of conflict resolution. Take a page out of the Flash's book, just step into a hallway and talk things out. Speaking of which, this season also suffered a bit from what I've come to call run, Barry, run syndrome, where it seems like every episode, a character has to learn a very basic lesson about something they regularly do. The lessons that were learned mostly had to do with teamwork, or believing in yourself, or believing in other people, and maybe it's just me, but it feels like these lessons should have been internalized last season. But Ross, I'm sure you're saying, you're so handsome and right all the time, but how else are they supposed to fill 23 episodes of TV? Well, my answer would be do it in 13. It would work a lot better. It's just hard to feel like the characters are growing when they're hitting the same beats over and over again. And it's pretty telling that these in-episode conflicts barely factored into the main plot by the end of the season. Sure, it gave the characters stuff to do, but everything got resolved in a few short conversations anyway, like in every other season. Also, side note, just don't make any more than 6 seasons of TV shows like this. Ever? Seriously, when have you ever heard someone say, oh yeah, I like the show, but it really started working in season 8? Anyway, once you can see the skeleton of the show, and this is the same fundamental issue I have with The Flash, every episode kind of bleeds together into this generally enjoyable but mostly unmemorable mush in my brain. Speaking of unmemorable, let's talk about the villains. First of all, I do think that splitting the season with two main villains was a smart move to better pace out the conflict with both of them. It was definitely an improvement over, say, season 4, but unfortunately, I just wasn't really a huge fan of either of these characters. Let's start with Caden James, or should I say Caden Lames? My least favorite aspect of Arrow and network TV in general is when it tries to tackle hacking as a serious plot point. I'm not a computer science expert or anything, but I'm pretty sure it's all nonsense. So the fact that the first main villain of the season was an evil hacker who essentially wanted to blow up the internet just felt like a step backwards into goofiness after season 5. It wasn't all bad though. Michael Emerson was great in the role and definitely elevated a mostly underwritten character, but that character still struck me as pretty bland, especially his motivation, which was just the last villain's motivation, but more thematically obvious because of Oliver's son now being more in the picture. But that motivation was all based on a lie anyway, and Caden's actions and personality didn't really reflect Oliver at all, besides them wanting to protect their kids, which is a pretty universal human truth. Really, Caden James was just some crazy guy who got lied to and then decided to stop being crazy when he found out the truth. And then it turned out that he was just a red herring for the most predictable secret villain in recent memory. They really tried to make this a moment. They keep trying to find out who doctored this footage of Oliver killing Caden's son. It could be anybody. Who's betraying him? It could be one of the villains who have intimate personal connections with members of Team Arrow, or it could be this other guy we've never seen before, but who's always around.
Oh my god, who's the traitor, guys?
Like Caden, Diaz was definitely elevated by his actor. Kirk Acevedo has a really strong screen presence, but Diaz never really felt any more special than your average villain of the week. He didn't really have any discernible characteristics beyond being evil and menacing, and his motivation was literally that he was bullied as a kid and felt inadequate. Is this a Disney Channel original movie? The way he gets over this is by setting his childhood bully on fire, which didn't really make him seem intimidating, just really petty. They devoted an entire episode to Diaz, but I'm sorry, I just didn't care. Great performance, but he just felt like some guy. And maybe that was the point, to not make him feel like a distinct supervillain, but I don't think him being really boring was part of the point. At least Damien Dark was fun to watch, you know? He had one of those personality things. Diaz's plan to infiltrate Star City through politicians and public officials was refreshing from the usual doomsday stuff, don't get me wrong, but it didn't unfold in any particularly interesting way. It honestly felt like a pretty easy threat for Team Arrow to handle. And maybe Diaz's story would have come to a more interesting climax if his goal wasn't just to join some secret evil organization that we never heard about until episode 19 of 23.
Small price to pay for introduction to the Quadrant.
I thought they were an urban legend.
They're very real.
Honestly, as soon as they introduced another secret evil organization, I just checked out. I'm so tired of secret evil organizations. How have we never heard of this one by now? I know the point of that reveal was to be like, ooh, of course you've never heard of them. They're so secret and so evil. But they've said that about every other secret evil organization that's popped up. I don't really buy it anymore. I don't know. Maybe it's just me, but when villains turn out to be just a group of generically rich people in a boardroom with limitless resources, it just feels really unimaginative. I guess that's the issue with TV shows like this, though. After a while, they become slaves to their own status quo. Things change, sure, but the change is often superficial and impermanent. Be honest, by season 6 of this show, when characters fought and said they were done working together, did you buy it for even a second? Like I said, once you can see the skeleton of the show, if the writing isn't good enough to disguise that formula, it's pretty easy to see how things will play out. That is why I made that Flash predictions video in the first place, because I felt like I was seeing the same things over and over again, which is why I found it so funny when people said I watched the season ahead of time and faked that video to, I don't know, look smart or something. It's just lazy writing, guys. I made a lazy video about lazy writing.
Do you get it now?
Also, if you really think I would measure my intelligence based on how accurately I can predict the plot beats of a TV show, please go outside and take a walk, because there is so much more to the world. The funny thing is, though, I actually did fake that video. Or did I? No, I didn't. Or did I? No, I actually didn't. 100%. Hand to God. Or did I? Anyway, I won't pretend like this season was all disappointing garbage or anything, because it wasn't. There was some pretty good stuff in there. I like that the majority of Oliver's story was about applying more and more pressure to the balance of his personal life, his professional responsibilities, and his vigilante life, and seeing those conflicts finally come to a head. I also like the family dynamic with Oliver, William, and Felicity that slowly developed over the season. I'm glad they didn't just try to mine cheap drama out of it, and it was nice to see Oliver finally get a sense of real stability. The best part of all this was Oliver grappling with wanting a life after his mission, dreaming of eventually giving up the hood and living a normal life, which he slowly started to get, but the end of the season proved that he just couldn't have it. It was frustrating, but in the right way. I just really wanted to see Oliver catch a break for once. The real problem was that too many things felt like a retread of season 5 a little too often, like the familial connections and the idea of having to break Oliver. Still, in the face of a subpar story, I think Stephen Amell did a fantastic job. I just really respect him as an actor. His dedication to this role and this universe really helped keep this character shining from beginning to end. Even if it was pretty ridiculous that he was able to keep his secret this long. I mean, the amount of close calls he's had from season 1 almost felt like a running joke by this point, which would be fine if I wasn't also expected to believe that everyone in this universe still sees the Arrow and the Green Arrow as two different people.
Roy Harper is not the Green Arrow. Tommy Merlin is most certainly not the Green Arrow.
Surely comparing any two HD photos of these two guys would reveal that they are in fact the same very public, very recognizable guy, but that's not the biggest pill this show has asked me to swallow, so whatever. What I refuse to believe is how big David Ramsey's arms are. They have to be inflating them in post. It's just ridiculous. How much can one human being lift? Another aspect of this season I really liked was Earth 2 Laurel's redemption arc. It's the kind of extremely bizarre but still heartfelt storytelling that only comic book media can really get away with. The connection she formed with Quentin felt natural. I liked how they both dealt with their emotional baggage and eventually bettered each other because their emotions overrode their instincts. And they ended up proving each other right and not giving into their worst instincts. It was just a really nice little story. And then Quentin Lance, a major character since the pilot, just died off screen. Great.
Super cool, actually.
That's this season in a nutshell, really. For everything I liked, there was something holding it back. And in the end, it was all just kind of okay. It was missing something, a really unique punch to set this story and these villains apart. There are shades of it here and there, but it all feels either too rushed or too stretched, so the story mostly ended up feeling like more of the same. It all led up to another fist fight on some roof, and this one somehow also didn't end with the villain dying, despite the fact that he definitely should have died.
He was launched off a rooftop. He shouldn't have been able to go anywhere at all.
Diaz doesn't go down easy.
Why? He's just some guy. Which also raises the ever-present question of why Oliver never just called Barry and asked him to run over and punch Diaz in the face very hard, but whatever. There was just no real tension this season. When Team Arrow split up or Oliver got backed into his 27th unbeatable corner, it was just hard to buy into. I mean, the last season did end with every major character trapped on an exploding island and everyone surviving except the one who wasn't a major recurring character or a series regular, so It's hard to establish stakes after that. Well, Thea was put in a coma, I guess, but Thea's pretty much been in a metaphorical coma since season 3. The writers clearly had no idea what to do with her most of the time. All Thea really does is leave town or die. So, that was season 6. Serviceable, fun, nothing particularly exciting, but never really boring. Just solid, middle-of-the-road TV. Great stunt work and action sequences, though. I can rarely fault Arrow for that. And I'll admit, I did get really excited during the Deathstroke two-parter. But only because I realized the actor playing Slade's son was also that one guy from Riverdale who said one of the most unhinged lines of dialogue ever put to screen.
Not me. I dropped out in the 4th grade to run drugs to support my nana.
Also, the guy who plays Elio on Riverdale had a really small role later in the season as a cop. Blink and you'll miss it. All around, it was a great season for Riverdale fans. And if you're not a Riverdale fan, then you get the hell out of here. I want nothing to do with you. So, after a mostly underwhelming return to this show, Season 7 started off really strong. I actually think this season premiere was the strongest of the entire show. Oliver in prison was a refreshing change of pace. It was the status quo shift I was craving, and seeing him so firmly out of his element and reluctant to adapt was really well handled, especially through some spectacular action scenes. And that moment where you think you're seeing a flashback and then at the last second it turned around and was actually a flash forward, that was such a fantastic moment. It got me amped. And for the most part, well, really just the first half of season 7, well, really just half of the first half, really just the prison stuff, I had a lot of fun. Of course, with high praise like that, I obviously had some issues, but let's focus on the good stuff for now. The prison arc was great from start to finish. I loved seeing Oliver struggling to maintain his heroic ideals and then slowly realizing that they wouldn't help him. It put Oliver on the same level as his enemies in a way, especially considering he had to work alongside them at times, and I liked his little friendship with this guy, who I pegged as a secret crazy from moment one. Let's face it, it was about as subtle as, well, the last big twist. And as straight as all the prison stuff was played, they still had time for fun stuff, like an underground prison fight club. How many Riverdale connections are there? Who knows? If there was anything weird about how it all played out, it was that later in the season, they mentioned that Oliver is supporting prison reform, and then just kind of drop it. It just struck me as kind of weird that prison didn't seem to change Oliver all that much, and I wish they'd leaned more into him questioning his ideals after he was freed. Maybe that was supposed to be what was driving Oliver for the rest of the season, but it didn't really feel like it. Anyway, I also really enjoyed the flash forward plotline. It kind of felt like fan fiction at times, but in a good way. It wasn't at all what I expected, but it ended up being really entertaining, even though the wigs on the aged up characters were truly shocking. Overall, exploring the dystopian future of this world and seeing the next generation emerge as heroes was a fun little side story that never really felt like filler. They even found a way to make the Deathstroke mask not look really stupid. Also, Catherine McNamara, hi, I'm single and my DMs are open, so, marry me? McNamara me? Although, I did mention filler, and unfortunately, everything else in this season kind of felt like it was just killing time. Whenever the show wasn't focusing on prison or the future, it really felt like it was just spinning its wheels, and the stuff the other characters were doing wasn't all that interesting. Outlawing vigilantes in Star City makes sense, I guess, but it's not like operating outside the law is that much of a stretch for this team. They've kind of always been doing that. Also, carrying Diaz over as the main villain for the first half of this season was an interesting choice, but maybe if I liked that character in the first place, I would have been more engaged. I think the intention was to make the other heroes feel overwhelmed, having to face a main villain without Oliver and working against the police, but Diaz still never felt like much of a threat. I think Oliver inflicted more damage on Team Arrow in Season 6 than Diaz did in his entire time on the show. Also, if I may nitpick, for a show that plays so dark and gritty, The fact that none of the characters ever, like, broke a bone or had any significant injury unless it was a full subplot was just... It was some disbelief I had trouble suspending here and there. For all the build-up Diaz got and all the resources he allegedly had, he was always taken out pretty easily. The first time he went down this season, I actually said out loud, "Oh, that's it?" And then the second time, it was almost funny.
That was easy.
I guess that's the problem with functionally beating the villain at the end of a season and then bringing him back. All he can really do is be beaten over and over again. And it didn't really help that his backup was just the Longbow Hunters, who were the most interesting henchmen since the Knights of Ren. These guys were extraordinarily lame, and aside from a cool sound design trick they used in fight scenes, they were just nothing. Also, Diaz started taking this strength drug, but that had nothing to do with anything besides people getting punched harder than usual in fight scenes. I guess they couldn't license Bane? And once Diaz was out of the picture, he was replaced by the strangest villain in the show's history. Let's talk about Emiko. Emiko is pretty much everything I dislike about this show coalesced into one character. It's kind of fascinating. Her backstory is the peak of the show's soap opera tendencies. She's actually Oliver's secret sister. Ooh, because Robert Queen had a secret family. Woo, whoa, surprising. Honestly, it just made me wonder how many insane secrets this guy had. Well, actually, he was a billionaire, so... No, it checks out. So, Emiko takes up the mantle of the Green Arrow when Oliver's in prison, hunting down criminals and crossing them off her Season 1-esque list, and then starts bonding with Oliver once he's released and he learns her origins. She then kills Diaz, basically off-screen, and then immediately admits it to Laurel, diffusing the mystery that had just been established, and she never even explains why she did it. She had no connection to Diaz, at least not one that was stated, and her characterization didn't really reflect anything that Oliver was going through this season, so why do this? And then it turns out that she's part of yet another secret evil organization we've never heard of, and she's actually its leader.
We need your son. After all, he's our boss.
Do you see what I mean about the show repeating itself now?
I feel kind of dumb for not pegging Emiko as a sneak villain from the get-go, but only because she spent so much time bonding with Oliver and learning how to be a better hero, only to then turn around and say she never cared and go full big bad, and then turn back at the last second and die. It was all so strangely handled. Emiko's story just felt so out of place, especially in the build-up to Oliver leaving to face the upcoming crisis. So what was the point? Emiko wasn't a cautionary tale for Oliver's actions or anything. He'd already gotten past all this. Was there a point? I have a very hot take here, so please prepare yourself accordingly. In a story, things should have a point. Then again, everything in the present day after the prison arc just kind of felt like killing time until Crisis, because Oliver wasn't dying until next season, but he had to do something until then. So we mostly got a weird blend of stuff we've already seen, because when it ain't broke, don't try, I guess. To be fair, I don't envy the writers for having to think up enough story to fill 23-hour-long episodes for 7 years. There will always be lulls and repetition after a show like this goes on that long. It happened with the Vampire Diaries too, God rest its soul. And yet, at the same time, maybe because the end of the show was so close, there were a few points where the writers were able to cut loose and try some new stuff. The flash forward plot was a big gamble that could have been a disaster, but it turned out really fun. I also really liked when they experimented with form, like the documentary episode.
It's like, looks like I'm a director, right? That's awesome. I messed it up. Sorry.
Or that episode that was all told through flashbacks from different perspectives with that great Roy Harper bloodlust twist. That was just good TV. Just being able to get a new sense of perspective beyond the usual visual style of the show added such a burst of energy, even if it only lasted a short while. Individual moments and episodes like that stood out to me far more than usual this season, maybe because everything else after prison felt so generic. A lot of the in-episode conflicts felt shallow and bland. I didn't ever really care what the side characters were doing unless it made no sense at all. Like that stupid conflict about Oliver not liking that Felicity was carrying a gun. Like, my man, you're a billionaire and a known vigilante with a long list of enemies. She should carry 12 guns. Or the fact that Dinah was promoted to police captain even though she was almost arrested for being a vigilante. You'd think that would affect her career mobility. Or the fact that Earth 2 Laurel was able to keep her doppelganger's job as district attorney despite her only previous job experience being evil murderer. But in the grand scheme of things, little nitpicks like that didn't really bother me that much. And ultimately, it was all overshadowed by how the season ended, which frankly absolutely crushed it. I loved seeing how the Green Arrow evolved over this season as an idea, and the moment where Oliver rejected the mask and went into the field anyway was just fantastic. I also loved how they tied that moment back into the pilot, not really bringing it full circle, but treating it like a rebirth, because Arrow's always had a great way of being retrospective without being too wink-wink about it.
Right, well, you slept with my wife. Well, now my ex-wife. Dude, all that is in the past, okay?
So, seeing Oliver work alongside the police and become fully embraced by the public without having to hide felt like the final payoff of that character, that hero, which was appropriate because this season finale was essentially a goodbye to Arrow as we knew it. And I thought it was a pretty heartfelt goodbye, literally and figuratively, especially with Oliver's death feeling so imminent and inevitable. Plus, in a universe where main characters have died with some regularity, putting this much emphasis on the idea of death had a real sense of permanence. Honestly, I was getting pretty choked up as the episode ended, and when the credits rolled, I couldn't wait to see how they'd wrap everything up in the final season. Because for all of the comic book goofiness and soap opera melodrama, the connections between these characters still ring true after all this time. It's also a testament to how a good finale can save a somewhat messy season. Never underestimate the power of a good season finale. So yeah, in the end, season 7 was also just fine. There were some standout moments here and there, but it was mostly just typical Arrow. Like season 6, it was serviceable, and that's just fine with me. Again, it also would have benefited from being much shorter and from very different villains, but the action sequences still held my attention after all this time, even with a few awkward effect shots and sound effects. Really, this season was everything great and everything bad about Arrow on full display. In the end, I guess this season accomplished its goals, so that's a win. I'm also glad the show was able to still feel so grounded and tactile this season, despite the silly things going on, because I am so tired of silly, goofy comic book Arrow, of the big VFX extravaganza finales, especially on a TV budget, so, you know, let's hope season 8 kept it low-key. It's kind of hard to talk about this season as a season because it isn't really a season. It was more like a prelude to Crisis on Infinite Earths than anything. But as far as preludes go, it was a pretty solid prelude. I'll stop saying prelude now. Season 8 benefited greatly from a faster pace and a much shorter runtime, thus vindicating me in my seasonal length theory. Haha, yeah, I really showed them. Take that, TV show whose success and impact will far outweigh anything I could ever accomplish. Seriously though, there was no fat on the story at all, as simple as it was. Plus, they were able to balance the past and the future of the show really well. The premiere was essentially an alternate universe retelling of the entire first season, and it was a really fun throwback right up until they pulled the rug out and destroyed Earth 2. I thought that was a fantastic way to set the stakes for Crisis, especially since Earth 2 was where all this multiverse stuff started back in Flash Season 2. From there, Season 8 was just a wild, fun, fun, time-traveling, reality-hopping, retrospective ride. Also, something about seeing Oliver, Diggle, and Laurel as, like, multiverse mercenaries also felt like fanfiction, but in a good way, where it kind of felt like the show I wish I'd always been watching. Speaking of things that feel like fanfiction, I was a little worried when the future kids suddenly showed up in the present day that it would be too much to juggle, but it ended up being a lot of fun to see them interact with the main cast.
I'm gay.
Buddy, I know.
Although, having a main character's daughter travel back in time to connect with a father she never knew while he teaches her to be a better hero and control her angry impulses seemed like a familiar plot line. Where have I seen that before? But when it came down to it, I preferred this take on that story, and their connection and final moments before Crisis really resonated despite how little time they'd spent together. I guess the way I'd sum up this season is to say that it was pure fan service, but not empty fan service. And the pre-Crisis stuff wasn't just about having fun and tying up loose ends, it was also about preparing Oliver, and the Groundhog Day-esque time loop episode was a great metaphor for him learning to accept his death and his limitations. Also, Paul Blackthorne came back. Sorry you died for no reason. So, given that the actual series finale didn't air until after Crisis, and the events of Crisis directly influence how the show ends, I figured I couldn't just skip this crossover like the rest of them. And since Crisis is also the culmination of every other CW DC show out there, I figured I shouldn't go in underprepared. So I went back and I watched every episode of every show across the past 2 years and took extensive notes to make sure I didn't miss a single detail. I'm just kidding. I didn't do any of that. I mean, I read some Wikipedia synopses to see what the Monitor's deal was, but all I really needed to know was that Oliver was supposed to die and Flash was supposed to die. And there was a flashback that outlined all that info anyway in the season 7 finale, so I was pretty much set. Also, just because of how these shows are written, if there's a very important piece of information that you as the viewer need to know, characters will talk about it a lot. So, let's see what all this was building up to and talk about Crisis on Infinite Earths. The most crucial thing you should know about my experience with Crisis is that I pretty much had no idea what was happening the entire time beyond dimensions are going boom because of Evil Guy. Watching Crisis with my level of relative expertise in the Arrowverse would be kind of like watching Avengers Endgame, having only seen Iron Man 1 through 3, Guardians of the Galaxy, and Thor Ragnarok. I don't really have any hot takes or mind-blowing insights because over the past year, I've really just stopped caring about superhero media in general. So 5 episodes of TV shows that I don't watch crossing over and telling me another story where the world is going to blow up, it didn't exactly get me hyped. In general though, as an event, Crisis was neat to watch, I guess. It was pretty much just a parade of references from beginning to end, but the amount of actors they were able to pull back was pretty impressive.
Holy crimson skies of death!
If you had told me back when Arrow Season 1 ended that this was where the show would go one day, I wouldn't believe you. And also I'd question why you were telling me that, and how would you even know that? Are you from the future? Are you me? Anyway, Crisis was a real testament to what the Arrowverse has accomplished and grown into over the past decade, to the point where they were able to bring in characters from mainstream blockbuster movies, even though I use terms like blockbuster and movie pretty loosely when talking about Justice League. As for the story Crisis told, it was fine. It was very messy, but that's to be expected when you're juggling so much stuff. My biggest issue was the handling of the most important part, which was Oliver's death. Killing him at the end of part 1 was a weird choice, and I don't think killing him twice was entirely necessary. I mean, considering that this guy has literally died before, maybe just do it once and make it count. I also think the pacing of the event suffered because it had to be spread out over 5 episodes. I think doing it in 4 parts would have been neater, even if one of the shows would have been quote-unquote left out. Part 5 as a whole just felt like a bunch of extra stuff the story didn't need, especially since the climax and Oliver's sacrifice felt so final, so bringing the main villain back immediately and everyone fighting him again just felt redundant. I do think that seeing everyone adjust to the new universe was fun, but would have made for a better epilogue than an entire episode. To save time, maybe just cut everything that Lex Luthor was doing, because that was all useless.
You took all the fun out of it.
Maybe instead of fighting the evil genocide alien and all his ghost things that definitely look like they're actually there, they could have had a bunch of villains from across the shows team up now that they'd all converged. But it's not my job to rewrite Crisis, and as wonky as the story was in places, the big moments hit well enough, and seeing this version of the Hall of Justice together made the 9-year-old part of me that still resides in my lizard brain very happy. If Crisis had happened 5 years ago, I probably would have loved it purely for all the references, but now it was just a bunch of stuff I watched, some of which I enjoyed. I would count it more as a remarkable achievement in TV storytelling than anything. Unfortunately, in terms of Oliver's story, his death didn't quite have the punch I was hoping for, but it was satisfying to see that to save the universe, he truly became something else and was able to do the biggest superhero thing possible. So it was a solid resolution, even if that something else was like a weird spirit thing, and the way he saved the universe was with a skybeam. The best way they could visually represent the rebirth of the universe was with a skybeam. Was it a joke for me? Honestly, after Crisis, I just never want to watch any of these shows again, because there's nothing I find less exciting than watching a bunch of people in leather outfits shoot lasers at CGI ghosts. It just made me wonder, why are all these people wearing leather? Is that really the most comfortable or tactically sound material out there? Surely there's some kind of body armor that would work better, or some sort of lightweight comic book metal. You could just make one up. So, that was the Crisis on Infinite Earths. I'm glad I watched it, and even if it didn't blow me away as a payoff to my limited experience with the Arrowverse, it was interesting to watch unfold. Even if after the first final battle, I did just kind of think, oh, that's it. Also, I find it really funny that they set aside almost a fifth of the crossover to Batwoman and establishing her as the Bat of the future, and then Ruby Rose just left the show.
You are the Bat of the future, Kate Kane. You are the paragon of courage.
So, that brings us to the final 2 episodes of Arrow, which filled me with excitement and dread, because TV finales can be really great, or they can be, Game of Thrones. First, let's talk about episode 9, which was essentially a backdoor pilot for a potential new Green Arrow show following Oliver's daughter, Mia, taking up the mantle in the future after her memories of the pre-crisis timeline are restored. I really liked this episode. Honestly, a lot more than I expected to. It's got some wacky timeline stuff, I like the semi-futuristic setting, and it didn't just feel like Arrow again. It felt like its own thing. Surprisingly, I'd actually be down to see a few more episodes or maybe a season of this show come together if it gets the green light. If only because it means I get to watch Catherine McNamara beat people up.
God, I wish that was me.
So now, here we are at the Arrow series finale. 8 years of variable quality, a bunch of crossovers building the biggest and most intricately connected TV universe I've ever seen, all leading up to the first real ending for this franchise. No pressure. And how well did Arrow end its story? Well, I thought it was lovely. I don't know if I'd say it was one of the best TV finales I've ever seen, but it was definitely one of the most fitting and celebratory. It was a parade of wonderful little moments of reflection and closure, and pretty much every loose end was tied up in a satisfying way. It was nice to get a good, solid send-off for everyone. They even brought Ragman back. I missed that raggy boy. And the scenes I expected, like the final look at the cave, Oliver's funeral, Felicity's return, it was all good. It was all just so nice. There were a couple of beautiful little character touches for Oliver too, like the fact that in the universe he rebooted, he got to save his mother. I was even happy to see Emiko come back, even if it meant that Oliver didn't stop his dad from abandoning his second family, I guess. And is she still the leader of an evil terrorist organization? Whatever. The final note of the episode was about as saccharine as you can get, with Oliver and Felicity together in some sort of afterlife or pocket dimension, and as blatantly neat and tidy as that is, it still made me happy. Here comes one more blazing hot take, but I like happy endings. And really, what could I expect? A finale like Twin Peaks? I knew I would get a fairly conventional ending, but it was handled really well. It gave me what I wanted. I felt what I wanted to feel, and sometimes that's all you can ask of TV. Like I said, Season 8 is kind of hard to evaluate as a typical season because it just isn't one. In a way, Arrow kind of became a victim of its own success because the universe around it became so expansive and tightly knit and ambitious that the show had to move away from its own story and serve the larger one. But you know what? I prefer that to another season of Oliver trying to fight some martial arts expert who wants to destroy the city. That story had been told enough already. The show did what it needed to do to wrap things up in a satisfying way, and in most cases did them exceptionally well. We even got one final classic Arrow fight scene, probably the most impressive of the entire show, which was obviously the intention. And when I heard that classic music sting for the final time, I just had a big smile on my face. So, that was Arrow. It was good, I guess. I don't know. It's really hard to sum up my feelings on this show. I've changed and it's changed so much since the first episode aired. This is obviously a show that I loved very deeply and one that I criticized very emotionally, but also one that I walked away from because I was tired of the cycle of hope and disappointment. So coming back to it after a few years, after my view on media and critiquing has changed so much, I really couldn't get angry at it. I just kind of enjoyed it. I think that was helped by the fact that I knew the show was over and that I was working towards the end because it let me adopt a more retrospective approach. I wasn't actively invested in the story so much as I was just curious to see where it was all going. And yeah, I had issues with the last few seasons, sure, but the highs stuck out far more than the lows, and eventually the lows just faded away in the big picture. Maybe it's because I didn't come to these seasons looking for stuff to make fun of or get angry about. I just didn't want to feel like I was wasting my time by finishing the show, and I don't feel like I did. I saw the show as a whole in a much different light when it was all over, and I'm glad I finished it now and not when I was still in my hyper nitpicky comic book fanboy phase. Arrow is not a show that I'd actively watch today, but I'm glad I finished it just to see the story completed. My interest in this universe and in most superhero media started with Arrow, so I figured it would be appropriate for it to end there too. And if I had to pick a place where I could end my tenure as the Arrow guy, then I'm glad it was one where I got closure and satisfaction as opposed to one where I just walked away annoyed. It's not like all traces of Arrow are gone forever. I'm sure Stephen Amell will pop up in a cameo somewhere down the line. Diggle will definitely show up as Green Lantern by the next crossover, and fans will very likely see more of the next Green Arrow, so I hope that all turns out good. But in this time where superhero media is like an overwhelming, never-ending tsunami of content you have to consume to keep up, I was just hoping to get an ending where I could walk away from this universe and feel satisfied. When a TV show is with you that long, eventually you just start hoping for a good ending, and I got one. Arrow was never really my favorite or my least favorite show on TV per se, but it was very important to me when I was finding my tastes, and I'm really glad I could still find enjoyment in it after my tastes have changed so much. Ultimately, I think what Arrow and the creative minds behind it were able to accomplish is far more impressive than the highs and lows of just one show. And in retrospect, that's far more important to me than a couple bad seasons or a couple repetitive ideas. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about Arrow. forever, for real this time. So thank you very much for joining me on this journey. And if you're new, once again, don't watch the old videos. They're bad. I hate them. I really do hope if you were excited to see this video that you got what you wanted. I know many people were looking forward to it, and I was very anxious about not going out on a high note, so hopefully I did. But for some, I'm sure this video won't be nearly as vitriolic or angry as it should have been, in which case I would invite you to go forth and seek out the other man-children on this website yelling at TV shows made for children. Look for Funko Pops, just like shelves and shelves of unopened Funko Pops. That's when you know you've found safe haven. And now, just to make sure that the final note of this video isn't bitter sarcasm, I just want to say to Arrow and to everyone who made it, writers, cast, crew, everyone, from beginning to end, thank you. You did a great job. You built something incredible, and it really meant a lot to me. I owe it so much. So, thank you. So guys, those are my final thoughts on Arrow. Thank you very, very, very much for watching this video, and hopefully you enjoyed. If you did, feel free to leave a like and subscribe for more. I'll see you next time.